Halo, halo? Czy nas słyszycie? To nasz ostatni komunikat. Dziś oddziały niemieckie wkroczyły do Warszawy. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła.
After a devastating defeat in the September campaign, many Polish soldiers were taken prisoner by the Germans, or hid and later joined the Polish resistance. Some, however, together with the Polish government in exile, fled to France. They very quickly began to be organized into a real army by the Polish government. Their commander-in-chief was Władysław Sikorski. If you're interested in a more detailed description of the formation of Polish troops in France, I've discussed it in detail in my other video, the link to which can be found in the upper right corner of the screen. Today, we will take a look at the fate of Poles fighting in France in the 10th Armored Cavalry Brigade. The 10th Armored Cavalry Brigade in France was created from the remnants of the 10th Cavalry Brigade fighting in the defense of Poland in 1939. Its formation began in November 1939 in the Kętki town camp. The command was entrusted to General Stanisław Maczek. At the beginning, the French took their time arming the Polish tankers. Only 42 obsolete Renault FT tanks were received, useful only for training. Everything changed when the real threat appeared in May 1940, Germany's attack on France. At the end of May, the Poles received 66 Renault R35 tanks and 24 Renault R40 tanks. In addition, the brigade was equipped with, among others, 25mm and 47mm anti-tank guns, 25mm AA guns, Renault UE armored carriers, motorcycles and trucks. The brigade also received 15 Char B1 bis heavy tanks, but it turned out to be a mistake and the tanks had to be handed over to the French. As time later showed, the Poles would certainly make a good use of them. This is what Franciszek Skibiński, chief of staff of the brigade, wrote about all the confusion in the French command. During this and the next day, we received orders every few hours to march to the northwest of Rouen, then to the east, then cancelled. We had the overwhelming impression that the French High Command had completely lost its head and acted accidentally, without a plan, impulsively. Franciszek Skibiński. Report on the combat operations of the 10th Armored Cavalry Brigade in the 1940 campaign in France. In February 1940, the Finnish Company was formed, which, together with the Polish Independent Highland Brigade, was to take part in the Winter War. As you know from my episode about Poles in Narvik, combat operations in Finland ended before the French managed to send their expeditionary troops there. We will now focus on the part of the 10th Brigade commanded by General Maczek and separated from the rest of the unit. On June 10th, it was assigned to the French 4th Army. On June 12th, it was stationing in the Avis area as an army reserve. But when the French defense lines collapsed, the Poles were assigned to the 6th Army and ordered to carry out delay operations in the Montmorency area. The exchange of fire took place near Frémentières, where German motorcyclists were spotted. The reaction of our motorcyclists to the news that they will come into contact with the enemy at any moment was extraordinary. The platoon set off at full throttle and as ferociously as fox terriers chasing a boar. We saw them turn west into Champeaux-Bas and on Frémentières at 80 km/h. From later reports we learned that the courage and war enthusiasm of the motorcyclists was much greater than their training. At Champeaux-Bas, Officer Cadet Sapieha was killed and the platoon was halted by fire. 3 motorbikes managed to break through the German lines via Frémentières, but they never returned. Franciszek Skibiński. At the same time, the dragoons of the Polish brigade under the command of Major Zgorzelski took Champeaux-Bas. After a while, they were attacked by several German tanks supported by motorcyclists. The Poles put up a strong resistance and repelled the attack by destroying 2 tanks with AT guns and dealing heavy losses to the enemy. At 2 p.m., the Poles were ordered to cover the retreating French units near Montgivreux. In the forest near the village, the brigade was bombed. The Poles suffered minor losses and knocked down 1 German plane with their AA guns. News came from Montgivreux that the French 59th Infantry Division had ceased to exist. Soon after, the remnants of the French troops moved in disarray into the same forest. Moments later, when the troops crowded in one place, about 40 Ju-87 Stuka planes flew over the forest. The forests have become a complete hell. As a result of the bombing, it was full of smoke and fire. A dozen of our and French vehicles were burning, including a vehicle loaded with anti-tank mines, which exploded one by one and flew through the forest like rockets. Despite the psychological havoc, the casualties weren't high. A dozen or so were killed and wounded. When the planes departed, the Polish tanks assaulted the road. There they found a weak German armored unit, which retreated after a short skirmish, losing 2 light tanks. When the situation calmed down, a joint retreat of Polish and French units was ordered. Along the way, the French colonel was very surprised that we were unable to hold a 20 km wide front. You have 40 tanks. They need to be set up in one line every 500 meters, and that way you can easily defend a 20 km front. In response, General Maczek expressed his surprise why, with such brilliant ideas, the entire French corps couldn't hold that 20 km front, and 1 Polish battalion was supposed to do it. The 10th Armored Cavalry Brigade managed to close the gap between the French 4th and 6th Army. The Poles continued their retreat. On the night of June 14th to 15th, they covered the withdrawal of the French 2nd Infantry Division and its crossing to the other side of the Seine River in the Doche area. The brigade then marched a few kilometers east and crossed the Seine on the Bourguignon Bridge, and from there it moved south to the safe point in the Juilly-sur-Sasse area of Villemorien. Here an unpleasant incident happened. Due to the lack of fuel, the commander of the tank battalion, Major Stanisław Gliński, ordered the destruction of some of the vehicles, and because of that he was deprived of command. Moving Polish troops were constantly attacked by the German Luftwaffe, losing a lot of people and equipment. There was no air or even medical support of any kind. Doctors disappeared from the unit without a trace in the first few days of operations. The American Red Cross sanitary column disappeared after the first major bombing. During the entire operation, none of us saw a single French or English plane in the air. However, hundreds of German planes were constantly flying above us. French anti-aircraft artillery became completely silent on June 13th. The French troops that surrounded us absolutely didn't want to fight. Entire battalions and regiments surrendered to few German motorcyclists. On the morning of June 16th, the brigade was ordered to capture the village of Montbard and thus allow the French 42nd Infantry Division to cross the Canal de Bourgogne. The brigade was, at that time, more than 70 kilometers away from the city, in the Chaours area, and its fuel supplies were running out. So, on the general's order, some vehicles were destroyed, and fuel was poured into the others. Since that time, the 10th Brigade had only 17 tanks. On June 16th, at 11 am, the 10th Brigade departed for Montbard. The problem was breaking through the traffic jam in the town of Lane. The situation was further complicated by an unidentified explosion near the main intersection, which caused a general panic. Poles used tanks to make their way through abandoned French vehicles clogging the streets. However, some subunits of the brigade got stuck in the town and thus were cut off from the main forces. In such a situation, they were surprised by the German armored motor unit. The Poles, however, repelled the attack and captured 30 Germans. In the evening, an incomplete brigade reached Montbard, passing by the retreating French soldiers. On the road, there were already wrecked carts, cars, corpses of horses and French soldiers, presumably shot from an ambush. After the general's short speech, the Poles at 10 p.m. assaulted the town defended by the German troops of the 66th Regiment of the 13th Motorized Division. The fights lasted until 2 a.m. Polish tankers managed to capture the northern part of the town and defeat the German troops, which retreated hastily to the other side of the Canal de Bourgogne. On the Polish side, 12 soldiers were killed and 50 were wounded. The Germans, on the other hand, lost around 60 people, and a dozen or so were taken prisoner along with heavy equipment. According to the Polish officer Franciszek Skibiński, the retreating Germans blew up the bridge and thus made it impossible for the 10th Brigade to cross. Most likely, however, it wasn't the bridge on the Canal de Bourgogne, but the one on the Brenne River, parallel to the canal. The situation was sealed, however, by a report received by General Stanisław Maczek at 2 a.m. It informed about the change in the direction of the march of the French 42nd Infantry Division, which turned south towards Dijon. So, the Polish general decided to withdraw from the town before dawn. On the morning of June 17th, more vehicles with empty fuel tanks were destroyed, leaving only 3 Renault R35 tanks. They moved along the Canal de Bourgogne towards Dijon in search of a good crossing point. Between Dargny and Flavigny, our spearhead come across German armored cars. Outside one of them sat a French officer waving a white scarf and announcing the ceasefire. Relations between the Poles and the French were particularly tense at the end of the French campaign. From the first day, we were almost fully aware that this was a lost battle and campaign, and that we found ourselves in a trap in which we will be closed in any day now. General Maczek decided to stay in this trap and fight to the end with the forces of a small and weak brigade of Poles among the crowds of fleeing French armies. As a result, our soldiers looked down on the French and treated them with contempt, and there was no more effective argument to shock an exhausted tanker or Ulan than the phrase "do not behave like a Frenchman", nie zachowuj się jak Francuz. On the same day, the last 3 tanks ran out of gasoline. They were destroyed. It was decided to get out of the German encirclement on foot. On the evening of June 17th, the Poles reached the highway, on which German armored and motor columns were already marching. The soldiers of the 10th Brigade realized that they were completely encircled. In addition, there was a shortage of food and water. General Maczek decided to disband the brigade. And so, after a week of fighting in Champagne and Burgundy, scattered Polish troops began to retreat towards the coast. Some of them managed to reach Great Britain and later served in the famous 1st Armored Division, fighting among others in the Battle of Falaise in 1944. Of the 1,700 soldiers fighting in the unit of General Maczek, around 1,200 were lost. 50 were killed, 120 were wounded, and 1,020 were lost or taken prisoner. Currently, the traditions of that particular Polish unit are continued by the modern 10th Armored Cavalry Brigade unit. The second part of the 10th Brigade, numbering over 2,200 soldiers, didn't take part in the fight, and on June 22nd it was loaded onto the British ship Royal Scotsman in the port of Le Verdun. Additionally, the 2nd Tank Battalion of Major Zygmunt Chabowski, with more modern Renault R40 tanks, remained in the Arpajon-Versailles area. On June 20th it set off towards Bordeaux, arriving there on June 24th. There it took part in the fighting in the La Verrerie area. On June 25th it was evacuated from the port of Saint-Jean-de-Luz to Great Britain. The 3rd and 4th tank battalions were never completely formed, and the men and equipment were evacuated on June 24th. That's all I wanted to tell you in today's episode, dedicated to the Polish tankers of the 10th Armored Cavalry Brigade in France. In the following episode, I'm going to discuss the topic of Polish airmen in the defense of France. So, if you're interested in this topic, don't forget to subscribe, click that notification bell and rate the video. See ya!